As he ventures deeper into the crumbling tunnel, what he discovers hidden in the darkness leaves him breathless and transforms not just his struggling farm, but the forgotten history of an entire county. Before we dive into this extraordinary tale, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below, and if stories of hidden history fascinate you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've prepared something truly remarkable you won't want to miss. Jack Reynolds had spent nearly his entire life working the same stretch of land in rural Wisconsin that his grandfather had purchased in the aftermath of the Great Depression. The sprawling 120-acre property, nestled between rolling hills and dense woodlands in the heart of America's dairyland, was known throughout Oak Ridge County for its premium dairy products and the distinctive red silo that stood as a landmark visible for miles around. The Reynolds farm, as locals called it, had once been the pride of the community, a testament to perseverance through the harshest economic times and a symbol of agricultural innovation in the region. The farm had flourished under the careful stewardship of Jack's grandfather, Franklin Reynolds, who had transformed it from struggling acreage into one of the most productive dairy operations in the state during the 1940s and 50s. The distinctive red silo, built in 1934, had become something of a local landmark, standing tall above the surrounding countryside as a symbol of the farm's success. Generations of county residents had used it as a navigation point, with turn left at the Reynolds silo becoming common driving instructions for decades. But the past 15 years had brought mounting challenges to the once thriving family business. The consolidation of the dairy industry had pushed prices ever lower, while corporate farming operations had made it increasingly difficult for family farms like the Reynolds to compete. Jack had watched with growing despair as neighboring farms were sold off one by one, their lands absorbed by corporate entities, or converted into suburban developments as the city of Millfield, some 30 miles away, continued to expand its reach. At 58, Jack was weathered beyond his years, his hands calloused from decades of labor, his face lined with the worries of watching his family's legacy slowly slip away. The financial pressure had been building steadily, with loan payments becoming increasingly difficult to meet and equipment repairs being postponed well beyond what was prudent. His wife, Martha, had been forced to take a job in town to supplement their dwindling farm income, while their son, Michael, had chosen a career in engineering rather than returning to the increasingly uncertain prospect of dairy farming. The historic red silo, which had stood as the crowning achievement of Franklin Reynolds' early years on the farm, had become particularly concerning. Its foundation had begun showing alarming signs of deterioration, with cracks spreading through the concrete base that Jack's grandfather had poured by hand nearly 90 years earlier. Estimates for proper repairs had come in at figures that might as well have been millions given the farm's financial state. Each time Jack walked past the massive structure, he felt a mixture of pride in his family's history and dread at its uncertain future. Every morning as he made his rounds, checking on the reduced herd of Holstein dairy cows and inspecting the aging equipment that kept operations running, Jack couldn't escape the growing fear that he would be the Reynolds who finally lost the farm. The thought of being the one who failed where his grandfather and father had succeeded was a burden that seemed to grow heavier with each passing season. He'd already sold off 20 acres to keep the bank at bay, the hardest decision he'd ever made, watching surveyors stake out land that had been in his family for generations. The situation hadn't always been so dire. Jack remembered vividly the prosperous decades of his youth and early adulthood, when the barn would be bustling with activity and the silo would be filled to capacity with silage to feed their substantial herd through the harsh Wisconsin winters. His father, Robert Reynolds, had built upon Franklin's foundation, introducing modern milking parlors in the 1970s and expanding the herd to over 100 head of prize dairy cows. The Reynolds name had been synonymous with quality throughout the state, their milk sought after by the finest creameries and cheese producers in a region known worldwide for its dairy excellence. Jack had inherited not just the land, but his father's innovative spirit, implementing sustainable farming practices and organic certification well before they became industry trends. For a time, these initiatives had kept the Reynolds farm viable, while others failed, but the relentless pressure of industrial agriculture and rising operational costs had gradually eroded their competitive edge. The organic certification that had once commanded premium prices was now commonplace, and the small batch, artisanal approach that had defined the Reynolds operation for generations was increasingly difficult to sustain in a market dominated by volume and efficiency. The iconic red silo stood as a painful reminder of this decline. Once the pride of the property, it had deteriorated to the point where Jack no longer used it for its intended purpose, storing silage instead in modern plastic-wrapped bales that dotted the fields like giant marshmallows. The silo's distinctive red paint had faded and peeled, its metal dome rusted in places, yet Jack couldn't bring himself to tear it down. It represented too much of his family's story, too much of what the Reynolds name had meant to Oak Ridge County for nearly a century. Local historical societies had expressed interest in the structure, noting its unusual design and historical significance to the region's agricultural heritage. The Reynolds silo was one of the few remaining examples of a particular construction style popular in the early 1930s, featuring handcrafted wooden interior components that had largely disappeared from the modern farming landscape. But historical significance didn't pay for repairs, and the various preservation grants Jack had applied for had either been denied or offered sums far too small to address the structure's mounting issues. The financial realities of maintaining a historic structure while keeping a struggling farm operational created a constant tension that Jack felt with every decision. The most recent bank assessment had been blunt. The farm's operations were no longer generating sufficient income to service its debt. The loan officer, a young woman who hadn't even been born when the Reynolds farm won its last county fair blue ribbon, had suggested exploring options, with a sympathy that somehow made the situation even more humiliating. Jack had explored every option he could think of to keep the farm viable. He'd diversified into specialty cheeses, partnered with local restaurants for farm-to-table initiatives, even attempted to launch a small agritourism business highlighting the farm's organic practices and historical significance. Each venture showed promise initially, but required capital investment that stretched the farm's already precarious finances even thinner. The cheese-making operation had been particularly heartbreaking. After investing in equipment and training, changing regulations had required costly upgrades they simply couldn't afford. The weight of these accumulated disappointments bore heavily on Jack's shoulders as he walked his property each evening, a ritual his grandfather had begun 90 years earlier. Franklin Reynolds had purchased the land when no one else would take the risk, during the depths of the Depression, when banks were foreclosing on farms across America. Family law held that he'd worked 3 jobs to make the down payment, believing deeply in the land's potential despite its rundown condition. Jack wondered what his grandfather would think of him now, on the verge of losing everything Franklin had worked so hard to build. The most difficult aspect of the farm's decline was explaining it to Michael during his son's increasingly infrequent visits home. Michael had grown up loving the farm, but had recognized its challenges early, pursuing engineering with Jack and Martha's full support. He'd established himself in Minneapolis, married, and started a family of his own. During holiday visits, Jack could see his son surveying the farm with a mixture of nostalgia and concern, no doubt noticing the deferred maintenance and reduced operations. They never discussed it directly, the potential end of the Reynolds farming tradition, but the possibility hung in the air between them during every conversation about the future. Martha had been his rock throughout it all, never once suggesting they give up, despite the toll the financial stress had taken on their lives. Her job as an administrative assistant at the county hospital provided crucial health insurance and supplemental income, though Jack knew she was exhausted working full-time while still helping with farm bookkeeping on evenings and weekends. They'd postponed retirement plans indefinitely, the dream of traveling during their golden years replaced by the more immediate goal of simply holding on to their home. As winter approached and another challenging year drew to a close, Jack faced the increasingly likely possibility that the upcoming spring might be the last planting season for the Reynolds farm. The thought of watching the property being divided up for development or absorbed into a corporate farming operation was almost unbearable, but the financial realities were becoming impossible to ignore. The farm that had weathered the Great Depression, multiple wars, and generations of agricultural upheaval seemed finally to have met its match in the 21st century's industrialized food system. The red silo stood as a daily reminder of both the farm's proud history and its uncertain future. Its shadow stretched across the barnyard each afternoon, a silent timekeeper marking the passage of seasons and years. Jack had done everything humanly possible to preserve his family's legacy, but at night, lying awake beside Martha, he increasingly wondered if it was time to accept the inevitable. The thought brought no peace, only a profound sense of failure that not even his wife's reassurances could dispel. Little did Jack know that fate was about to intervene in a way he could never have imagined, and that the deteriorating silo he'd been worried about for so long was about to reveal a secret that would change everything. The Reynolds farm stood on the precipice of its greatest challenge, but also its most extraordinary revelation. The warning came on a brittle November morning, the kind that hinted at the harsh Wisconsin winter to come. Jack was in the milking parlor before dawn, the rhythm of the machines providing a comforting background to his thoughts as he moved among the remaining 38 Holstein cows that comprised the once substantial Reynolds herd. The radio crackled with the voice of the local meteorologist, warning of an unusual weather system moving into the region, predicting wind speeds and rainfall amounts rarely seen outside of summer thunderstorms. Jack had weathered countless storms on the farm, but something about the urgency in the forecaster's voice made him take special notice. After finishing the morning milking, he spent the day securing equipment and checking drainage ditches that had already been struggling to keep up with the unusually wet autumn. The silo was his greatest concern. The cracks in its foundation had visibly widened over the past month, and the thought of high winds pushing against the tall structure sent a chill of apprehension through him that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature. By mid-afternoon, the sky had darkened to an ominous grey-green that experienced farmers recognized as a harbinger of severe weather. Martha called from the hospital to say she'd be staying in town with her sister, rather than risking the drive home on increasingly treacherous roads. Jack completed his preparations as the first heavy raindrops began to fall, securing the barn, doors, and moving the few pieces of functioning equipment under shelter. He was making a final inspection of the silo's foundation, flashlight in hand despite the early hour, when he noticed something that stopped him cold. A new crack had appeared, running diagonally across the concrete base and disappearing beneath the soil. Unlike the other fissures that had developed gradually over years, this one looked fresh, the exposed concrete a startling white against the weathered grey of the surrounding surface. As Jack watched, A trickle of water began seeping through, carrying with it particles of soil from beneath the foundation. "Not now," Jack muttered, straightening up as the wind began to howl around the corner of the barn. "Not tonight." But he knew that the situation had escalated beyond his ability to address it with temporary measures. The storm would have to pass before he could properly assess the damage, and he could only hope that the structure that had stood for almost 9 decades would survive one more night. The rain intensified as darkness fell, drumming against the farmhouse roof with growing fury. Jack sat at the kitchen table with a cup of cooling coffee, listening to the storm's assault and calculating how much more the aging drainage system could handle before the lower fields began to flood. The weather radio continued to issue increasingly urgent alerts, flash flood warnings, high wind advisories, and reports of power outages spreading across the county. His phone buzzed with a text from Martha. "Roads completely flooded. Staying at Susan's tonight. Please be careful and don't take any risks." Jack sent a brief reply, assuring her he would stay safe, though his definition of risk had always been more flexible than his wife's. Outside, the wind howled with increasing intensity, driving sheets of rain against the windows with such force that Jack wondered if the ancient glass panes would hold. Around midnight, with the storm at its peak, Jack was jolted from a restless sleep on the living room couch by a sound that rose above even the roaring wind and pounding rain. A deep, grinding crack, followed by what felt like a tremor running through the ground beneath the house. He was on his feet and pulling on rubber boots before fully awake, driven by the instinctive response of a lifetime spent protecting his land and livestock. The beam of his heavy-duty flashlight barely penetrated the wall of rain as Jack fought his way across the farmyard, his slicker offering minimal protection against the horizontal downpour. Lightning revealed glimpses of the landscape in stark, blue-white flashes, the barn still standing, the equipment shed intact, the cattle huddled in their sheltered portion of the field. But when his light swept toward the silo, Jack's heart sank. Even through the storm's chaos, he could see that a portion of the foundation had given way, causing the entire structure to list noticeably to one side. "No, no, no," he muttered, pushing forward against the wind to get a closer look. Decades of farming had taught Jack to respect the destructive power of gravity. A leaning silo was a catastrophe waiting to happen, threatening not just itself, but potentially the nearby barn if it fell in that direction. He needed to assess the damage immediately, storm or no storm. As he approached, another flash of lightning revealed the full extent of the disaster. The crack he'd noticed earlier had widened dramatically, and an entire section of the circular foundation had collapsed inward, creating a dark void beneath the structure. The silo itself had shifted, its normally perfect cylindrical shape now visibly distorted as the metal groaned against stresses it was never designed to withstand. Jack circled as close as he dared, his flashlight beam revealing more details of the foundation's failure. The concrete hadn't simply cracked. It appeared to have collapsed into some kind of void beneath it, as if the ground itself had given way. This wasn't the typical foundation failure he'd feared. Something else was happening here. A sudden, violent gust nearly knocked Jack off his feet, and the silo emitted a screech of protesting metal that cut through even the storm's roar. The decision was immediate. No building was worth his life. Jack retreated to the relative safety of the barn, where he could monitor the situation while sheltered from the worst of the storm's fury. From the barn doorway, he watched as nature dismantled another piece of his family's legacy. With each powerful gust, the silo leaned further, the metal skin buckling in places as the structure twisted against forces it could no longer resist. Shortly after 2 a.m., during a particularly violent series of wind gusts, the inevitable happened. With a sound like a freight train, The once proud Reynolds silo collapsed in on itself, the metal shell crumpling as it fell into what appeared to be a widening hole where its foundation had stood for nearly 90 years. Jack felt a hollow ache in his chest as he watched the destruction unfold. The silo had been more than just a farm structure. It had been a constant in his life, a symbol of everything the Reynolds family had built. He had climbed its interior ladder countless times as a boy, thrilled by the forbidden adventure and the dizzying view from its dome. His father had taught him to manage silage there, lessons in agriculture and responsibility intertwined. And now it was gone, another piece of the Reynolds legacy lost to time and circumstance. He remained in the barn until dawn, dozing fitfully on a pile of hay, as the storm gradually diminished to a steady rain. As the first grey light filtered through the barn windows, Jack ventured out to survey the damage in daylight. The farm had weathered the night reasonably well overall. Some downed branches, pooling water in the lower fields, a section of fence down where a tree had fallen. But his gaze was drawn inevitably to the collapsed silo. The scene was even more dramatic than it had appeared in the darkness. The silo's metal shell had crumpled like an aluminum can, folding in on itself as it collapsed downward rather than toppling sideways as Jack had feared. But it was what lay beneath the wreckage that captured his attention and sent a jolt of adrenaline through his exhausted body. The foundation hadn't simply cracked or settled. It had collapsed into what appeared to be a substantial opening in the earth, too regular in shape to be a natural sinkhole. As Jack cautiously approached, he could see aged timber framing around what looked like a doorway leading into darkness, now partially revealed by the foundation's collapse. "What the hell?" Jack muttered, crouching to shine his flashlight into the opening. The beam revealed what appeared to be a set of crude wooden steps descending into the earth, their ancient treads still surprisingly intact. This wasn't a natural feature. Someone had built this deliberately and with considerable effort, and then concealed it beneath the silo's foundation. Jack's mind raced with possibilities. The silo had been built in 1934 during the waning days of Prohibition, but before the repeal had fully taken effect in every county. Wisconsin had been home to numerous bootlegging operations during those years, with its remote farms and proximity to Chicago, making it ideal territory for illicit alcohol production and distribution. Could his grandfather's farm have been part of that shadowy history? Common sense told Jack to call someone, the sheriff's department, the historical society, someone with proper authority, before exploring further. The opening looked unstable, the ancient timbers saturated with rainwater and visibly rotting in places. But generations of Reynolds' curiosity coursed through his veins, and before he could talk himself out of it, Jack was carefully picking his way down the exposed steps, testing each one with his weight before committing to the next. The stairway descended about 10 feet before leveling out into what appeared to be a tunnel, its walls and ceiling supported by timbers similar to those used in old mine shafts. The air was surprisingly dry once past the exposed entrance, carrying an earthy scent mingled with something Jack couldn't quite identify. A faint chemical smell, reminiscent of his grandfather's workshop, but somehow different. Jack's flashlight beam cast ominous shadows along the tunnel walls as he ventured further from the entrance. The passage ran straight for about 20 feet before making a sharp turn to the left. Years of farming had given Jack an excellent sense of direction. He estimated the tunnel was heading toward the old woodlot that bordered the eastern edge of the property. The construction was crude but effective. Vertical support beams placed at regular intervals, with horizontal crossbeams supporting a ceiling of rough-hewn planks. The floor had been leveled and packed hard, though decades of disuse had allowed tree roots to penetrate in places, creating treacherous tripping hazards that Jack carefully navigated. As he rounded the bend, Jack's flashlight revealed a wider, section of tunnel with an alcove cut into one wall. Within this recess stood an artifact that confirmed his suspicions, the corroded remains of what was unmistakably a copper still, its once gleaming surface now green with verdigris, but its purpose still evident. Surrounding it were rotting wooden crates, glass bottles in various states of preservation, and what appeared to be the rusted components of a primitive pumping system. "Grandpa, you old fox," Jack whispered, a smile spreading across his weathered face despite his exhaustion. Franklin Reynolds, the pillar of the community, the respected dairy innovator, had apparently maintained a sideline in bootleg liquor production during Prohibition. The revelation should have been shocking, but somehow it only increased Jack's admiration for his grandfather's resourcefulness and determination to keep the farm afloat during desperate times. The tunnel continued beyond the still room, and Jack pressed on, his farmer's pragmatism momentarily overcome by burning curiosity. The passage began to slope gently downward, the construction becoming noticeably more refined as he progressed. The rough timber supports gave way to carefully fitted stonework in sections, suggesting multiple phases of construction or perhaps varying levels of expertise among those who had built it. Approximately 200 yards from the entrance, by Jack's estimation, the tunnel widened dramatically into a chamber roughly 20 feet square. Unlike the crude passageway, this room had been constructed with considerable skill. Its walls formed of fitted limestone blocks, its floor made of poured concrete that had held up remarkably well over the decades. Iron sconces still clung to the walls, designed to hold torches or lanterns, and the ceiling rose to a height of nearly 8 feet, supported by a series of stone arches that displayed surprising craftsmanship. But it was the chamber's contents that truly took Jack's breath away. Along 3 walls stood wooden shelving, much of it still intact, laden with dozens of dusty bottles whose labels identified them as products of now legendary distilleries, many long out of business. Crates stacked in one corner contained more. Bottles, these unmarked but sealed with wax, in the traditional method of preserving high-quality spirits. A large oak table dominated the center of the room, its surface covered with ledgers and documents protected from moisture by their storage. In tin boxes, Jack approached the table with the reverence of someone entering a long sealed tomb. The ledgers, when he carefully opened them, contained meticulous records written in his grandfather's unmistakable handwriting. Distribution schedules, financial transactions, and inventory lists dating from 1928 to 1934. The neat columns of figures showed substantial sums changing hands, far more money than the struggling farm could have generated through legitimate means during the depths of the Depression. As Jack explored further, the true extent of his grandfather's operation began to become clear. This wasn't merely a farmer's sideline to make ends meet during hard times. Franklin Reynolds had operated a significant node in a sophisticated distribution network that had supplied illegal spirits throughout the Midwest during Prohibition. The tunnel system, Jack discovered as he continued his exploration, extended well beyond the initial chamber, with passages heading in several directions. Some appeared to have collapsed over time, but others remained partially accessible, suggesting connections to neighboring properties and perhaps beyond. One of the intact tunnels led to another chamber of similar size to the first, but with a very different purpose. Where the first room had served as storage and accounting space, this one appeared to have been a gathering place, a genuine speakeasy hidden beneath the Wisconsin farmland. Rough-hewn tables and benches lined the walls, while a crude bar counter stood along one side, its surface still bearing the rings left by countless glasses set down by patrons long dead. Behind the bar, shelves held an assortment of glasses, serving trays and mixing implements, all covered in decades of dust, but otherwise perfectly preserved in the cool, dry, underground environment. A wind-up phonograph stood in one corner, and beside it, A wooden crate contained records from the era, jazz recordings, dance bands, and popular singers whose music had provided the soundtrack for this secret gathering place. Jack sank onto one of the benches, his mind reeling with the implications of his discovery. The Reynolds farm had harbored a significant bootlegging operation and an illegal drinking establishment during Prohibition, activities that could have resulted in his grandfather's imprisonment and the loss of the farm had they been discovered. At the time, yet Franklin Reynolds had taken the risk, presumably to preserve his land and provide for his family during the economic devastation of the Depression. The risk had clearly paid off, Jack realized, as pieces of family history suddenly aligned in a new context. The farm's remarkable expansion in the late 1930s and early 1940s, which family lore attributed to Franklin's dairy innovations, must have been funded at least in part by the profits from his illegal bootlegging operation. The modern milking parlor, the expanded herd, the new equipment that had positioned Reynolds Farm at the forefront of the region's dairy industry, all potentially made possible by bootleg liquor money laundered through legitimate agricultural expansion. As the reality of his discovery settled in, Jack found himself torn between amazement at his grandfather's audacity and a new appreciation for the lengths to which Franklin had gone to preserve the family farm during America's darkest economic hour. This hidden aspect of the Reynolds legacy cast everything Jack thought he knew about his family history in a new light, not diminishing it, but adding layers of complexity and resourcefulness he had never suspected. The farmer in Jack couldn't help but calculate what this discovery might mean for the farm's current predicament. The historical value alone was significant, but the collection of vintage spirits, if authentic and properly preserved, could be worth a fortune to collectors. The documentation of a functioning Prohibition-era distribution network and speakeasy, complete with original furnishings and equipment, would be of enormous interest to historians and museums. For the first time in years, Jack felt something, like hope stir within him, not just for temporary financial relief, but for a new chapter in the Reynolds farm story. This underground complex wasn't just a relic of the past, it represented the lengths to which his grandfather had gone to ensure the farm's survival. In his own way, Franklin Reynolds had been facing the same challenge Jack now confronted: the possible loss of the family legacy during desperate economic times, and had found an unconventional solution that secured the farm's future for the next generation. As Jack carefully gathered some of the documentation to take back to the surface, his phone suddenly buzzed with incoming messages. Signal apparently reached this section of the tunnel. Multiple texts from Martha showed increasing concern about his safety after the storm, and he quickly responded to reassure her that he was unharmed. The final message gave him pause. Michael called. He's driving up tomorrow to check on us, and the farm says he wants to talk about the future. Jack stared at the phone screen, a smile slowly spreading across his face. His son was coming home, concerned about the farm's future, at precisely the moment when that future might have just taken an unexpected turn. It seemed that Franklin Reynolds wasn't the only one with fortuitous timing in the family. Tucking several key documents securely inside his jacket, Jack began the journey back through the tunnel system toward daylight. The still drizzling rain and grey sky seemed somehow less oppressive than they had before his discovery. The collapsed silo, once a devastating loss, now appeared in a different light, not an ending, but perhaps the beginning of something new for the Reynolds farm. By mid-morning, the rain had finally stopped, sunlight breaking through the clouds, in tentative shafts that illuminated the aftermath of the storm. Jack had spent the past hour carefully documenting his discovery with his phone's camera, taking numerous photos of the tunnel system, the still room, the speakeasy, and particularly the ledgers and bottles. The battery warning flashed as he captured the last images, a reminder that he'd been underground far longer than planned. Upon returning to the surface, Jack found several missed calls from Martha, who had finally been able to leave her sisters. "Your house," as the floodwaters receded. He called her immediately, trying to keep the excitement from his voice as he assured her he was safe. He mentioned only that the silo had collapsed, but that he was unharmed, deliberately omitting his underground discovery until she could see it for herself. "Michael should be here by early afternoon," Martha informed him. "He sounded worried on the phone. I think he wants to talk about options for the farm." The hesitation in her voice told Jack exactly what kind of options their son had in mind, the kind that involved real estate agents and retirement communities, discussions they'd been avoiding for months. "Good timing," Jack replied, unable to suppress a note of satisfaction. "I've found something he should see." After hanging up, Jack turned his attention to securing the tunnel entrance. The collapse of the silo foundation had left it partially exposed to the elements, and while the tunnels themselves seemed remarkably well preserved, he worried that further exposure to rainwater could damage the contents. Using salvaged wood from the barn and a tarp from the equipment shed, he constructed a temporary covering that would protect the entrance until more permanent measures could be taken. As he worked, his mind raced with questions about his grandfather. Family stories had painted Franklin Reynolds as a model of rectitude, a church-going family man who had built his dairy business through honest hard work and innovation. The existence of the bootlegging operation added a completely unexpected dimension to this carefully cultivated image. Had his father known about the tunnels? Had other family members been involved? And perhaps most importantly, why had the entrance been sealed beneath the silo foundation rather than simply filling in the tunnels when Prohibition ended? Jack was securing the last corner of the tarp when a vehicle turned into the long farm driveway. Martha's white sedan splashed through puddles as she returned home, followed closely by their son Michael's black SUV. Jack straightened up, brushing mud from his hands, as he prepared to share his discovery with his family. Martha was out of her car first, hurrying across the muddy yard to embrace her husband with uncharacteristic intensity. "I was so worried when I couldn't reach you," she said, stepping back to examine him with a critical eye. "You look exhausted. Have you slept at all?" Before Jack could respond, Michael joined them, concern evident on his face. At 34, he was the image of Jack in his younger years, though his hands showed the smooth skin of an engineer rather than the calluses of a farmer. "Dad, are you all right? We tried calling all morning." "I've been a bit busy," Jack replied, unable to suppress a smile that confused both his wife and son. "The silo's gone. Foundation gave way completely in the storm, but that's actually turned out to be a good thing, believe it or not." Michael glanced at the collapsed structure, professional assessment replacing familial concern as he surveyed. "The damage. That's going to be a mess to clean up. The insurance might cover some of it, but—" He trailed off, clearly calculating the financial implications of yet another setback for the struggling farm. "Forget the insurance," Jack said, his smile widening. "You both need to see what I found under it." Leading his bewildered family to the makeshift covering he'd created, Jack pulled back the tarp with the flourish of a magician revealing his greatest trick. "The silo didn't collapse because the foundation failed," he explained, directing their gaze to the exposed timber framework. "It collapsed because there was something underneath it all along." Martha gasped, her hand covering her mouth as she took in the significance of the aged timbers, framing what was clearly a deliberate underground entrance. Michael crouched down, his engineer's mind immediately assessing the construction. "These are old," he murmured, running his fingers along the weathered wood. "Early 20th century at least, judging by the cut and the joinery." "Dad, what is this?" "It's a tunnel system," Jack replied, his excitement finally breaking through his usual reserve. And not just any tunnels. Your great-grandfather was running bootleg liquor during Prohibition. There's a still room, storage areas, even a whole speakeasy down there, and documents, ledgers showing transactions, distribution networks, everything. Franklin Reynolds, upstanding dairy farmer, was apparently also Frank the Tank to half the bootleggers in Wisconsin. The nickname was an improvisation, but it felt right. Jack could almost see his serious, hard-working grandfather living. This double life, respected farmer by day, liquor kingpin by night. The image brought an unexpected swell of pride. His grandfather had done what was necessary to keep the farm. Rules and laws be damned. Martha's expression shifted from shock to cautious interest. Is it safe down there? These storms have saturated the ground. The entrance is a bit rough, but the tunnels themselves are remarkably solid, Jack assured her. Your grandfather knew what he was doing, Michael. Some sections have stone arches that look like they could stand another 100 years. Michael was already reaching for his phone's flashlight. Let me see it, he said, the engineer's curiosity overcoming any reservations. If there's a structural issue, I want to assess it before anyone else goes down. Jack nodded in agreement, pleased by his son's practical approach, but confident in the tunnel's integrity. He had explored them extensively over several hours, and found most areas surprisingly well preserved, protected from moisture by the silo, foundation above, and what appeared to be careful drainage engineering below. Martha elected to stay above ground, promising to prepare lunch while the men explored. You both look like you could use a hot meal, she said, her practical nature reasserting itself after the initial shock. And Jack, you need to clean up. You're tracking century-old bootlegger mud all over my kitchen floors. As Martha headed to the house, Jack led Michael to the tunnel entrance, watching his son's face as he ducked through the opening and descended the wooden steps. The flashlight beam played across the timber supports, revealing the craftsmanship that had kept the passage intact through decades of Wisconsin winters and summers. This is incredible, Michael murmured as they made their way through the main tunnel. The engineering for this era is quite sophisticated. Look at how they've managed water drainage. See these channels cut into the floor? They redirect any seepage away from the main passages. Jack nodded, seeing the tunnels through his son's professional eyes for the first time. What had impressed him as solid, practical construction now revealed itself as carefully planned engineering, especially for work that must have been done in secret and likely at night. When they reached the still room, Michael's amazement grew. The copper still, though corroded, was clearly of professional quality and substantial size, not a farmer's experimental setup, but a serious production facility. The remains of the pumping system showed evidence of creative repurposing of agricultural equipment, with familiar dairy pump components modified to serve the distillation process. Grandfather wasn't just making moonshine in the woods, Michael said, examining the setup with growing appreciation. This was a professional operation with significant output capacity. Wait until you see the storage room and the speakeasy, Jack replied, leading his son deeper into the tunnel system. The main chamber, with its carefully stacked bottles and meticulous ledgers, elicited a low whistle from Michael. He carefully examined one of the dusty bottles, its label identifying it as a premium bourbon from a distillery in Kentucky, dated 1927. "Do you realize what these could be worth?" he asked, handling the bottle with reverence. "Pre-prohibition. Spirits are incredibly rare, especially with intact labeling and original seals. Collectors pay thousands for authenticated bottles like these, and you've got dozens here." Jack nodded, having reached the same conclusion during his earlier exploration. "And that's just the commercial stock. Check this crate." He indicated a wooden box stenciled with FR Special Reserve in faded black paint. "I think these might be your great-grandfather's own creations, house blends or custom distillations." Michael carefully opened the crate, revealing 6 bottles sealed with red wax, each bearing a handwritten tag with dates and cryptic notations. "This is unbelievable," he murmured. "A complete, untouched Prohibition-era collection with provenance and documentation. Museums would be fighting over just the papers, let alone the actual spirits and equipment." The excitement in his son's voice warmed Jack's heart. For years, Michael's visits to the farm had been tinged with barely concealed concern and occasional frustration as he witnessed his parents struggling to maintain the increasingly unprofitable operation. Now, for the first time in memory, there was genuine enthusiasm in his expression as he surveyed the hidden history beneath their land. The speakeasy room elevated Michael's amazement to new heights. The space was larger than Jack had initially realized, extending back into a secondary chamber that might have served as a private room for special guests or high-stakes card games. The furnishings, though crude by modern standards, were remarkably well-preserved. Solid oak tables and benches, crafted with the same practical durability as the barn furniture above. "They built all this right under the authorities' noses," Michael said, running his hand along the bar counter. "Right in the middle of farm country, with prohibition agents probably driving past the property regularly. The audacity of it is almost as impressive as the engineering." "Your great-grandfather didn't do things halfway," Jack replied, feeling a deepening connection to the ancestor he'd known only through family stories and faded photographs. When the farm was at risk during the Depression, he found a way to save it, not just temporarily, but setting it up for generations of success afterward. Michael nodded thoughtfully, settling onto one of the benches as Jack recounted his theory about how the bootlegging profits had funded the farm's expansion and modernization in the post-prohibition years. The ledgers showed substantial income through 1934, with careful notations about equipment purchases and herd expansions that aligned perfectly with the farm's documented growth during that period. "It makes perfect sense," Michael agreed. "The timing of the dairy operations expansion always seemed surprising given the economic conditions. This explains how he managed it while other farms were failing. What I don't understand is why he sealed it all up instead of dismantling it after Prohibition ended," Jack mused, flipping through one of the ledgers. "These tunnels represent an enormous investment of time and resources. Why abandon them completely?" Michael considered the question, his analytical mind working through the possibilities. Maybe he was concerned about legal repercussions even after repeal, or tax implications if the source of his capital investments was questioned, or perhaps... He paused, a new thought clearly taking shape. "What?" Jack prompted. "Maybe he didn't entirely abandon it," Michael suggested. "Prohibition ended in 1933, but these ledgers show entries through 1934. What if he continued some operation, perhaps shifting to different products or markets? The infrastructure was already in place, after all." Jack raised an eyebrow, considering the possibility. "You think your straight-laced, church-going great-grandfather might have continued in the black market even after repeal?" "I think my great-grandfather was clearly more complex than family stories suggested," Michael replied with a smile. "And I think practical farmers don't abandon useful infrastructure without good reason." The two men spent another hour exploring the farthest accessible reaches of the tunnel system, discovering additional storage areas and what appeared to be an alternative exit that had collapsed at some point, possibly deliberately sealed. Michael made notes and rough sketches on his phone, mapping the layout with an engineer's precision, while Jack continued photographing significant features. When they finally emerged into daylight, both men blinking in the afternoon sun, Martha was waiting with sandwiches and coffee. She had changed from her work clothes into jeans and a flannel shirt, her own curiosity evidently overcoming her initial caution. "I want to see it too," she announced, as they brushed dirt from their clothes. "After lunch," I've known this farm for 35 years and never suspected there was an entire underground world beneath our feet. Over lunch at the kitchen table, the conversation buzzed with possibilities. Michael, his earlier concerns about the farm's viability temporarily set aside, outlined potential approaches to their discovery. The historical value alone is significant, he explained between bites of sandwich, but the collection of spirits, the documentation, the intact speakeasy, together they represent something unique. There are museums dedicated to prohibition history that would consider this a major find. I don't want to just sell it off to a museum, Jack said firmly. This is part of our family history, part of the farm's story. Michael nodded, understanding his father's position. There are other options. You could preserve it in place, maybe develop it as a historical site or even a tourist attraction. The Reynolds Farm Prohibition Experience, guided tours of an authentic bootlegger's operation, with the working farm as the perfect cover story, just like in great-grandfather's day. Martha looked thoughtful, warming to the idea. We've talked about agritourism before, but this would be truly unique. People are fascinated by prohibition history, all those gangster stories and speakeasies. And most prohibition sites are in cities, Michael added, a rural bootlegging operation with all original equipment and documentation intact. That's something special. Add in the family connection, the fact that we're still working the same land, and you've got a compelling story for visitors. For the first time in years, Jack allowed himself to imagine a future for the Reynolds farm that didn't involve either financial ruin or selling out to developers. The tunnels and their contents represented not just historical artifacts, but a potential new direction, a way to honor his grandfather's ingenuity while ensuring the farm remained in the family for another generation. We'd need investment to set it up properly, he acknowledged, the practical farmer reasserting itself. Make the entrance safe, proper lighting, maybe restore some of the equipment to demonstrate how it worked. That's where I come in, Michael said, surprising both his parents. I've been thinking about making a change professionally. Engineering pays well, but I've been feeling disconnected from creating anything tangible. He took a deep breath before continuing. What if I came back to help develop this? Not just as a weekend project, but as a career shift. I could work remotely for my current firm part-time while we get this off the ground. The offer hung in, the air unexpected and emotionally charged. Jack had long ago accepted that his son would not follow him into farming, understanding Michael's decision to pursue engineering as the practical choice for his generation. The prospect of having him return to the farm, even in this modified capacity, stirred feelings Jack hadn't allowed himself to contemplate. "You'd come back?" Martha asked, clearly processing the same emotional implications. "What about Sarah and the kids? Minneapolis has been your home for so long." "We've talked about raising the kids in a more rural setting," Michael replied. "Sarah grew up in a small town herself. She's not opposed to the idea, and with remote work being so common now, her graphic design business could continue anywhere. With decent internet." Jack studied his son's face, looking for any sign of reluctance or obligation. What he saw instead was genuine enthusiasm and a spark of the same determination that had driven generations of Reynolds men to preserve their connection to this land, each in their own way. "Your great-grandfather bootlegged to save this farm. During the Depression," Jack said slowly. "Your grandfather and I kept it going through dairy farming as long as we could. Maybe this is your generation's way of continuing the legacy, finding a new purpose for the land that honors its history." While moving forward, the moment was interrupted by the sound of tires on gravel, a county sheriff's vehicle pulling into the driveway. Deputy Harris, a man Jack had known since high school, stepped out and approached with a concerned expression. "Jack, Martha?" He nodded in greeting. "Just checking on folks after the storm. Saw your silo took a hit." Everyone all right out here? 3 generations of farmer's instinct caused Jack to hesitate momentarily before responding. His grandfather had hidden his operation from authorities for years. That caution seemed to run in the family blood. But times had changed, and this discovery represented opportunity rather than risk. "Actually, Dave," Jack replied with a measured smile, "we found something interesting you might want to see. Seems my grandfather had some extracurricular activities during Prohibition." Deputy Harris's eyebrows rose with interest. "No kidding? Old Franklin Reynolds was running Shine?" "Not just running it," Michael interjected, unable to contain his excitement. "Producing it, distributing it, and hosting what appears to be the most exclusive underground bar in the county, all hidden right beneath the farm." As Jack led the increasingly intrigued deputy toward the collapsed silo and the tunnel entrance, he felt a curious sense of his grandfather's presence, as if Franklin Reynolds himself was watching with approval as another generation found a way to preserve the family legacy against the odds. The path forward wasn't clear yet, but for the first time in years, Jack felt the weight of impending failure lift from his shoulders. The Reynolds farm had survived the Great Depression through his grandfather's illicit ingenuity. Perhaps it would survive the current agricultural crisis through a surprising historical twist that connected past and present in ways none of them could have imagined. As Michael enthusiastically described their findings to the amazed deputy, Jack exchanged a look with Martha that contained equal measures of disbelief, hope, and determination. The same emotions that had likely sustained his grandfather during those uncertain Prohibition years. The news of Jack's discovery spread through Oak Ridge County with surprising speed. Deputy Harris, sworn to discretion but unable to contain his excitement, had mentioned the tunnels to his wife, who taught history at the local high school. She had told the principal, who happened to be on the County Historical Society board. By evening, Jack's phone was ringing constantly with calls from excited locals, historians, and even a reporter from the Millfield Gazette seeking confirmation of what was already being called the bootlegger's bunker. Jack fielded the calls with increasing weariness, providing minimal details, while insisting that proper documentation and assessment needed to be completed before public access could be considered. The torrent of attention was unexpected and somewhat overwhelming, but Michael stepped in to help manage the sudden interest, his professional demeanor a perfect counterbalance to the growing excitement. "We need to be strategic about this," Michael explained as the family gathered around the kitchen table that evening. "There are historical preservation considerations, potential legal implications, and significant decisions to make about how to develop the site. Once word gets out more widely, you'll have everyone from amateur historians to treasure hunters wanting access." Martha nodded in agreement, setting down a freshly brewed pot of coffee. "Not to mention tax implications. If these spirits and artifacts have significant value, we need to understand what that means financially before making any public statements." Jack looked at his family with newfound appreciation. Martha's practical approach to the financial aspects and Michael's strategic thinking complemented his own deep connection to the property's history. Together, they made a formidable team to navigate this unexpected development. "First thing tomorrow, I'll contact Professor Winters at the State University," Michael said, making notes on his tablet. "She's the leading expert on Midwestern Prohibition history and has worked with museums on authenticating artifacts from this period. We need a professional assessment before going further." "What about securing the site?" Martha asked, glancing toward the collapsed silo visible through the kitchen window. "That tarp won't keep out determined curiosity seekers for long. I've called Pete Johnson," Jack replied. "He's bringing his backhoe tomorrow to help clear some of the silo debris and install a temporary security door at the tunnel entrance. He owes me a favor after I helped with his irrigation system last summer." Michael looked up from his tablet with a thoughtful expression. We should also consider how this discovery changes the farm's situation. The immediate financial pressure might be relieved if the collection has the value I suspect it does, but we need a sustainable, long-term plan. The conversation continued late into the night, the excitement of discovery gradually giving way to the complex realities of managing such an unexpected historical find. By the time they turned in, the family had outlined a preliminary approach: secure the site, obtain expert assessment, explore the legal and financial implications, and develop a plan that balanced historical preservation with the farm's future. Viability. Morning brought clear skies and the rumble of Pete Johnson's backhoe turning into the driveway. The burly contractor had brought his son and 2 employees, their expressions a mixture of skepticism and curiosity, as Jack led them to the collapsed silo. "Never thought I'd be excavating a speakeasy on the Reynolds farm," Pete remarked, shaking his head in disbelief as Jack showed him the exposed tunnel entrance. "My granddad used to talk about getting his hands on quality liquor during Prohibition, even out here in farm country. Wonder if some of it came from your operation." Jack smiled at the thought. "Wouldn't surprise me. According to the ledgers I found, my grandfather had customers throughout the county. Your granddad might well have been one of them." While Pete and his crew carefully cleared debris from around the tunnel entrance, Michael took a call from Professor Winters, who had responded to his email with unexpected enthusiasm. "She can be here tomorrow," he reported to Jack after hanging up. "Says she's cancelling a faculty meeting because this could be the most significant Prohibition-era discovery in the Midwest in decades." By afternoon, Pete's crew had installed a solid oak door with heavy-duty locks at the tunnel entrance, carefully preserving the original timber framing while ensuring security. They had also constructed a temporary shelter around the entrance, protecting it from the elements and shielding it from casual observation. "What are you planning to do with all this, Jack?" Pete asked as they surveyed the completed work. "Museum, piece, tourist attraction, or just keeping it as a family secret?" "Still figuring that out," Jack admitted, "but I'm leaning toward finding a way to share it, honor my grandfather's ingenuity while ensuring the farm stays in the family." Pete nodded approvingly. "Smart thinking. My brother runs those vineyard tours over in Delwood County. Makes twice as much from tourism now as he ever did just selling grapes. People love that connection to history, especially when there's a good story behind it." After Pete and his crew departed, Jack, Martha, and Michael spent the remainder of the day preparing for Professor Winter's visit. They carefully selected key documents and artifacts to show her initially, organized their preliminary photographs, and prepared the most accessible portions of the tunnel system for inspection. Through it all, Jack found himself thinking about his grandfather in a new light, imagining Franklin Reynolds carefully managing his covert operation while maintaining his public persona as a respectable dairy farmer. "I wonder what Grandma knew," Martha mused as they sorted through ledgers at the kitchen table. She was always portrayed as so proper in family stories, the devoted farmer's wife who ran the household while Franklin built the dairy business. Did she know her husband was Wisconsin's answer to Al Capone? Michael laughed at the comparison. Based on these distribution records, he was operating on a pretty significant scale for a rural network, but I don't think we need to worry about discovering he ordered any Valentine's Day massacres. "She must have known," Jack said thoughtfully. "The farm wasn't that big back then, and this operation would have required regular attention, especially with a perishable product. I can't imagine he could have kept it completely secret from her." "Maybe she was part of it," Martha suggested. "The perfect cover. Who would suspect the church pianist of running liquor? The notion of his grandmother as a willing participant in the bootlegging business added yet another layer to Jack's evolving understanding of his family history. The more he learned about the underground operation, the more he realized how little he truly knew about the lives and choices of the generations that had worked this land before him. The arrival of Professor Eleanor Winters the following morning marked a turning point in their approach to the discovery. The diminutive academic, with her practical hiking boots and weathered field jacket, seemed more like a veteran archaeologist than a university historian. Her eyes lit up with professional excitement as Jack led her through the new door and down into the tunnel system. "Extraordinary preservation," she murmured, examining the timber supports with an expert eye. "The constant temperature and limited air exposure have prevented the usual deterioration we see in structures of this age." For over 4 hours, Professor Winters explored the tunnels, documenting features, examining artifacts, and occasionally expressing exclamations of academic delight that echoed through the underground chambers. Her particular interest focused on the ledgers and business records, which she carefully photographed page by page. "These are invaluable," she explained as they took a break in the speakeasy room. "Most of what we know about Prohibition-era distribution networks comes from law enforcement records, the operations that were caught. A complete business record of a successful operation that was never discovered provides an entirely new perspective on how these networks actually functioned." "So they're historically significant?" Michael asked. "Significant doesn't begin to cover it," Professor Winters replied, her academic reserve giving way to genuine enthusiasm. "This is a researcher's dream, a complete contextually intact prohibition, production and distribution operation with its business records preserved. The speakeasy alone would be noteworthy, but combined with the production facilities and documentation, this is genuinely museum quality." Jack felt a swell of pride at her assessment. He had known the discovery was important, but hearing a professional historian confirm its significance validated his growing sense that his grandfather's secret enterprise represented more than just a family curiosity. "What about the spirits?" Martha asked, gesturing toward the storage room with its shelves of dusty bottles. "Are they valuable beyond their historical context?" Professor Winters nodded thoughtfully. "Potentially extremely valuable. Pre-prohibition and prohibition-era spirits with verified provenance are among the most sought-after collectibles in certain circles. Some authenticated bottles from this period have sold at auction for 5-figure sums each." The family exchanged startled glances at this information. Even at the low end of that range, the collection represented a substantial value that could dramatically alter the farm's financial situation. "Before you start calculating potential auction proceeds," Professor Winters cautioned, noting their reaction, "I should emphasize that proper authentication, cataloging, and legal consultation would be essential. The regulatory status of spirits this old can be complex, and maximizing both historical and financial value requires careful handling." After completing her preliminary assessment, Professor Winters joined the family in the farmhouse kitchen, where Martha had prepared a late lunch. As they ate, the conversation turned to the broader implications of the discovery. "You have several options," the professor explained, spreading photographs of similar historical sites across the table. "Some families choose to donate such findings to museums or historical societies, either with or without the associated real estate. Others develop them as heritage tourism sites, offering guided tours and educational programs. A few have even incorporated historical elements into modern businesses. There's a craft distillery in Kentucky operating in a restored Prohibition-era facility, for instance." Jack studied the photographs with interest, particularly those showing renovated historical sites that balanced preservation with practical use. "What would you recommend, Professor, for preserving the history while keeping the farm viable?" "Based on what I've seen, I'd suggest a hybrid approach," she replied, selecting a particular photo showing a restored farm with historical elements. "The Reynolds farm has something special. Not just the tunnels themselves, but the continuity of family ownership and agricultural use. That connection between past and present is what makes this discovery particularly valuable from a historical perspective. She outlined a potential approach: preserve the tunnel system and speakeasy as a historical attraction, develop educational programs about rural prohibition history, and potentially partner with the university for ongoing research. Access. The farm itself could continue operations, perhaps shifting toward a heritage farming model that showcased traditional methods alongside the bootlegging history. The two narratives complement each other perfectly, Professor Winters explained. The legitimate farm operation that provided cover for the illicit underground business. Visitors could experience both aspects: the above-ground agricultural history and the below-ground prohibition story. Michael, who had been taking notes, throughout the conversation looked up with renewed enthusiasm. That aligns perfectly with what we were discussing yesterday. We could develop the historical aspects while maintaining the working farm, creating something that honors both sides of grandfather's legacy. I'd be happy to help you navigate the historic preservation grants and designation process, Professor Winters offered. A site of this significance would likely qualify for several funding programs that could offset restoration costs. After lunch, as the professor prepared to depart with preliminary photographs and notes, she made one final observation that particularly resonated with Jack. What strikes me most about this discovery is how it reflects the resilience and adaptability of family farms throughout American history. Your grandfather didn't turn to bootlegging out of criminal intent. He did it to preserve this land and provide for his family during extraordinarily difficult economic times. In that sense, he was continuing the true tradition of American agriculture, finding a way to survive and adapt when conventional methods weren't enough. After Professor Winters departed, promising to return with a team of graduate students for more thorough documentation, the family gathered in the living room to process everything they had learned. The historical significance of their discovery was now confirmed by an expert, adding weight to their responsibility as stewards of this unexpected legacy. "So what's our next step?" Martha asked. Always the practical one. Michael pulled out his tablet, opening a document he'd been developing. "Throughout the day, I've outlined a preliminary development plan based on Professor Winters's suggestions and our own ideas. Phase 1 would involve proper documentation, preservation, and security. Phase 2 would focus on developing the educational and tourism infrastructure, creating safe visitor access, interpretive displays, that sort of thing. Phase 3 would integrate the historical elements with the working farm, perhaps shifting toward heritage agricultural practices." Jack nodded approvingly, impressed by his son's initiative and organizational skills. "What about financing? Professor Winters mentioned grants, but those take time to secure." "I've been thinking about that," Michael replied. "Based on the professor's assessment of the spirits collection alone, we could potentially auction a small portion, maybe 10–15% of the bottles, to fund the initial preservation and development work. The rest could remain as part of the historical exhibit or be sold gradually to support ongoing operations." "And the farm itself?" Martha asked, looking to Jack. She knew how deeply he valued the agricultural tradition, regardless of the new historical dimension. "We keep farming," Jack said firmly, "but maybe we shift focus, like Michael suggested. Smaller scale, heritage methods, crops and livestock that complement the historical narrative. The kind of farming that would be interesting for visitors to see while they learn about the prohibition operation." The conversation continued into the evening, growing more detailed and practical as they moved from the initial excitement of discovery to the complex reality of developing a sustainable plan. By the time they turned in for the night, the outline of a new future for the Reynolds farm was taking shape. one that honored its complex past while securing its place in the community for generations to come. The following morning brought another unexpected development. Jack was inspecting the new security door with Michael when a sleek black car with government plates pulled into the driveway. A woman in a crisp business suit emerged, introducing herself as Dr. Catherine Morales from the State Historical Preservation Office. "We received an urgent call from Professor Winters yesterday evening," she explained, shaking hands with both men. "When Eleanor gets this excited about a historical site, we pay attention. I hope you don't mind the unannounced visit, but I happen to be in the region for another assessment." Jack welcomed her, though with a hint of caution. Government interest, while potentially beneficial, also raised concerns about restrictions that might be placed on their property and plans. "We're still in the early stages of figuring out what we have here," he explained as he led her toward the tunnel entrance. "Completely understandable," Dr. Morales assured him. "My role at this point is purely advisory, to help you understand the historical preservation options available and perhaps offer some guidance on best practices for documenting and protecting your discovery." As they descended into the tunnel system, Dr. Morales proved to be less effusive but equally impressed as Professor Winters had been. She moved through the spaces with professional efficiency, making notes on a tablet and occasionally photographing particular features. "The historical integrity is remarkable," she commented as they reached the speakeasy. "So many sites from this era have been heavily modified or stripped of original materials over the decades. To find one essentially untouched since the 1930s is extraordinary." While Michael guided Dr. Morales through the tunnel system, pointing out features they had discovered during their initial exploration, Jack found himself contemplating the rapidly expanding implications of what had begun as a simple structural failure during a storm. Within just 3 days, his collapsing silo had transformed from potential financial disaster into a discovery of historical significance, now drawing attention from academic and governmental circles. The farm that had been on the brink of failure was suddenly at the center of excited conversations about preservation grants, heritage tourism, and historical documentation. The irony wasn't lost on Jack. His grandfather had turned to bootlegging to save the farm during one economic crisis, and that same illicit operation might now save it during another, nearly a century later. As Dr. Morales completed her initial assessment, she joined Jack and Michael in the barn, where they could spread out her materials on a workbench. "Based on what I've seen, this site would almost certainly qualify for the State Register of Historic Places with strong potential. For National Register designation as well." She outlined the implications of such designations, the prestige and potential grant funding they could provide, but also the preservation requirements and oversight they would entail. "These designations don't prevent you from developing the site for tourism or education," she explained, addressing Jack's unspoken concern. "In fact, they often enhance such efforts by providing official recognition of historical significance." Michael asked detailed questions about the application process, timelines, and restrictions, his engineer's mind analyzing the practical implications of each option. Jack listened, feeling a complex mixture of pride in his son's engagement and trepidation about the changes these designations might bring to the farm he had managed independently for decades. "One more thing to consider," Dr. Morales added as she prepared to leave. "Professor Winters mentioned the collection of spirits and documentation you've discovered. From a preservation perspective, these artifacts are integral to the site's historical significance. If you're considering selling any portion of the collection, I'd strongly recommend having it properly catalogued and authenticated first, both to maximize its value and to ensure the most historically significant pieces remain with the site." After she departed, promising to send formal information about the registration process, Jack and Michael walked the perimeter of the farm in thoughtful silence. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across fields that had been worked by Reynolds, men for nearly a century, while in the distance the collapsed silo stood as a visible reminder of how quickly everything could change. "A lot to take in," Michael finally said, as they paused by the old oak tree that marked the farm's eastern boundary. 3 days ago, we were worried about how to keep the bank from foreclosing. Now we're discussing historical registers and tourist attractions. Jack nodded, leaning against the weathered fence post. "Your great-grandfather would probably get a good laugh out of it. His secret operation becoming a government-recognized historical site. Are you comfortable with where this is heading, Dad?" Michael asked, studying his father's face. "It's all moving pretty fast." Jack considered the question carefully. The farm had always been his anchor, its rhythms and responsibilities defining his life as they had defined his father's and grandfather's before him. The prospect of transformation, from private working farm to public historical attraction, represented a fundamental shift in that identity. "I'm still processing it," he admitted. "But I keep coming back to something Professor Winters said about agricultural adaptation. Your great-grandfather didn't set out to be a bootlegger. He became one because it was what the farm needed at that moment in history to survive. Maybe this is our moment to adapt, to find a new purpose for this land that honors its past while securing its future." Michael nodded, understanding the weight of the decision. "Whatever we decide, we'll do it together, as a family." As they walked back toward the farmhouse, where Martha was visible through the kitchen window preparing dinner, Jack felt a curious sense of continuity, despite the dramatic changes unfolding around him. The Reynolds farm had never been just about agriculture. It had been about family resilience, about finding ways to preserve a legacy through changing times and challenges. His grandfather had understood that essential truth, making difficult choices to ensure the farm's survival. Perhaps this unexpected discovery wasn't just revealing the past, Jack thought as they approached the house. Perhaps it was also illuminating the path forward, showing the next evolution of the Reynolds family's connection to this land that had sustained them for generations. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, a perfect Wisconsin autumn day that painted the surrounding countryside in shades of amber and gold. Jack rose early, his usual farm routine now augmented by new tasks related to the tunnel discovery. Despite his exhaustion from the previous day's events, he felt a renewed energy that had been absent for months, perhaps years, as the weight of inevitable failure had gradually lifted from his shoulders. Martha was already in the kitchen, preparing a substantial breakfast when he came downstairs, the scent of fresh coffee and frying bacon filling the air. "Professor Winters called while you were in the shower," she reported, sliding a plate in front of him. "She's bringing a preservation specialist and a graduate student. They'll be here around 10. Michael joined them moments later, already dressed for the day in clothes suitable for more underground exploration. Sturdy jeans, work boots, and a flannel shirt that made him look more like a farmer than the urban engineer he had become. Jack felt a twinge of something between pride and nostalgia, seeing his son dressed this way, so reminiscent of how he himself had looked at that age. "I've been thinking about accessibility issues," Michael said, spreading a hand-drawn diagram on the table beside his plate. "If we're going to develop this as a public historical site, we need to consider how to make at least portions of it accessible to people with mobility limitations. The main tunnel and speakeasy could potentially be modified without compromising historical integrity, but some of the narrower passages would be more challenging." Jack nodded, impressed by how thoroughly his son was already thinking through the practical aspects of their newfound opportunity. "The entrance is going to need significant work regardless. That makeshift doorway we installed yesterday is just temporary. I wonder if we could create a new, more accessible entrance elsewhere, Martha suggested, joining them at the table. Perhaps directly into the main speakeasy room, leaving the original tunnels intact, but providing an alternative access point for visitors who can't navigate the narrow passages. The conversation continued, exploring various approaches to preserving the historical authenticity of the discovery while making it viable as a potential tourist attraction. By the time they had finished breakfast, they had roughed out several possible configurations, each with its own advantages and challenges. Professor Winters arrived precisely at 10, accompanied by Dr. Eliza Chen, introduced as a preservation specialist from the state's Historical Commission, and Tomas Rodriguez, a doctoral candidate specializing in Prohibition-era social history. The expanded team brought additional equipment, specialized cameras, measuring devices, and sample collection kits that suggested a much more thorough examination than the previous day's initial assessment. We're approaching this as a significant historical discovery, Professor Winters explained as they gathered around the tunnel entrance. Dr. Chen's expertise will help us determine the best preservation approaches, while Mr. Rodriguez will be documenting the site's context within regional prohibition history. The morning passed in a flurry of activity as the academic team systematically documented every aspect of the tunnel system. Jack and Michael assisted as needed, moving lights, holding measuring tapes, and answering questions about the farm's history. Martha remained above ground, preparing lunch and fielding the continuing stream of phone calls from interested parties that had begun the previous day. "The construction techniques are fascinating," Dr. Chen commented as she examined one of the stone-arched sections. "This shows influences of European mining traditions, particularly German and Czech stonework methods. Were there immigrant communities in this area during the 1920s? Jack nodded, remembering family stories. "My grandfather mentioned a significant Czech settlement about 15 miles east of here. I believe they worked in the limestone quarries. Initially, before establishing farms, could he have hired some of them to build this?" "It's very possible," Dr. Chen replied, photographing the precise joinery of the stone arch. "This level of craftsmanship suggests experienced stoneworkers, not amateur construction. The question is how your grandfather managed to bring in skilled workers for such an illicit project without raising suspicions." Tomas Rodriguez, who had been examining one of the ledgers, looked up with interest. "I might have found an answer to that. There are entries here for payments to a Novak Construction for silo foundation work throughout 1928 and 1929. The amounts are substantial, but not unreasonable, for legitimate agricultural construction. If Novak was from the Czech community and willing to participate in the bootlegging operation, it would provide the perfect cover." Professor Winters nodded appreciatively at her student's insight. "Excellent observation, Thomas. This fits with patterns we've seen in other rural bootlegging operations where legitimate businesses served dual purposes. Mr. Reynolds, do you know if your family had any business relationships with the Novak family historically?" Jack searched his memory, the name triggering a distant recollection. "There was a Novak who operated a construction business in the county until the 1960s. Joseph Novak, I believe. My father occasionally mentioned him, said he built half the silos in the county during his time, including yours, apparently," Professor Winters remarked with a smile. "Though with some significant undocumented features, I'd be very interested to know if the Novak family archives contain any references to your grandfather or this property." The morning's exploration yielded several additional insights. In a previously unexamined alcove, they discovered what appeared to be a rudimentary communication system, a speaking tube that would have connected the underground operation to the farmhouse above. allowing those below to be warned of approaching visitors or authorities. Remarkably sophisticated for a rural operation, Professor Winters commented as she traced the tube's path upward through the earthen ceiling. Most bootleggers relied on lookouts or signal systems rather than permanent communication infrastructure. Your grandfather wasn't taking any chances. In another narrow passage that Jack hadn't fully explored during his initial discovery, they found a small room containing what appeared to be counterfeiting equipment, primitive but functional plates, for producing labels and tax stamps that would make the bootleg liquor appear legitimate. "This adds another dimension to the operation," Dr. Chen remarked, carefully photographing the equipment. Counterfeiting federal tax stamps was a separate federal offense, often prosecuted more aggressively than the liquor violations themselves. Your grandfather was taking significant risks. Jack felt a curious pride in these revelations of his grandfather's criminal enterprises. Franklin Reynolds, always portrayed in family stories as the epitome of rural respectability, had apparently operated a sophisticated illegal business that encompassed not just production and distribution, but also counterfeiting and elaborate security measures. "He wasn't just surviving," Jack said almost to himself. "He was thriving, taking calculated risks to build something substantial, even if it was outside the law." "Prohibition created a unique historical moment," Professor Winters replied, overhearing his comment. "It criminalized activities that many Americans, particularly those from European immigrant backgrounds, didn't view as inherently wrong. Your grandfather seems to have approached bootlegging with the same dedication and innovation he applied to dairy farming, as a legitimate business opportunity in challenging economic times." By early afternoon, the academic team had completed their initial documentation of the physical space and turned their attention to the artifacts and documentation. They set up a temporary work area in the barn, where Martha joined them to help catalog the extensive collection of ledgers, bottles, and equipment. "Based on these distribution records," Thomas explained, spreading several ledger pages across the workbench, "your grandfather wasn't just supplying local customers. He had regular shipments going to Chicago, Milwaukee, and even as far as Detroit. This wasn't a small-time operation. He was connected to major distribution networks across the Midwest." Dr. Chen, who had been examining the collection of spirits with growing interest, looked up from her inventory. "The quality and variety here is exceptional. Most rural producers specialized in basic spirits. Moonshine, bathtub gin, that sort of thing. But your grandfather was storing premium commercial products alongside his own productions. See these bottles? These are pre-prohibition whiskies from established distilleries, likely diverted from medicinal stocks. And these," she indicated a shelf of dusty bottles with handwritten labels. "These appear to be his own blended products, using sophisticated flavor profiles." Jack examined one of the bottles she indicated, its label marked "FR Special Reserve, 1931, in his grandfather's distinctive handwriting. He was creating his own branded products? "Absolutely," Dr. Chen confirmed. "And based on the ingredients listed on some of these formulation notes, he was creating quality blended whiskies, not just raw moonshine. Your grandfather appears to have been something of a master distiller in addition to his other talents." The revelation added yet another layer to Jack's evolving understanding of Franklin Reynolds. Not merely a farmer who turned to bootlegging out of necessity, but a craftsman who took pride in the quality of his illicit products, developing his own distinctive blends and building a business based on reputation and consistency. As the afternoon progressed, Professor Winters coordinated a video call with colleagues from the university's chemistry department to discuss the possibility of analyzing samples from some of the bottles to determine their exact composition and potential current safety. If any of these spirits are eventually to be tasted or sold, we'd need comprehensive analysis to ensure they haven't developed toxic compounds over the decades of storage, she explained. Michael, who had been taking detailed notes throughout the day, posed a question that had been increasingly on his mind. Professor Winters, given what we've discovered so far, how would you evaluate the historical significance of this site compared to other Prohibition-era finds? The professor considered the question carefully before responding. In my 25 years of researching this period, I've seen only a handful of sites with this level of preservation and completeness. Most prohibition operations were hastily dismantled when repeal came, or were discovered and destroyed by authorities during the period. To find an intact production facility, speakeasy, and complete business records is extraordinarily rare. I would rank this among the top prohibition discoveries in the country in recent decades. Her assessment sent a ripple of excitement through the group. Jack had understood that their find was significant, but hearing a leading expert place it in this category elevated the discovery beyond his expectations. The unique aspect here is the rural context, Professor Winters continued. Most preserved prohibition sites are urban, hidden bars in Chicago basements, secret distilleries in New York warehouses. The rural bootlegging networks that supplied these urban markets are much less documented and understood. Your grandfather's operation provides an unprecedented window into how these rural supply chains functioned. As the academic team continued their work, Jack stepped outside to get some air, finding himself drawn to the collapsed silo that had inadvertently revealed this new chapter in his family's history. The structure that had stood as a symbol of agricultural tradition for nearly 90 years now lay in ruins. But from its destruction had emerged something equally valuable, a different kind of family legacy that might ensure the farm's survival. In ways he could never have imagined, Martha joined him, slipping her hand into his as they surveyed the farm in the late afternoon light. "Penny for your thoughts," she said quietly. "I'm thinking about how perspectives change," Jack replied. "A week ago I was seeing this place as a failure. My failure. The family farm I couldn't keep viable, the tradition I couldn't maintain. Now I'm seeing it differently, not as something that has to remain exactly as it was to be preserved, but as something that can evolve while still honoring its history." Martha squeezed his hand, understanding. "Your grandfather knew that. The dairy farm everyone admired was built on bootleg whiskey money. He didn't see that as betraying the farm's purpose. He saw it as ensuring its survival." "Exactly," Jack nodded. "And now we have the same opportunity, not to abandon what this place has been, but to add a new dimension to it, just like he did." Their conversation was interrupted by Michael calling from the barn doorway, excitement evident in his voice. "Dad, Martha, you need to see what Thomas just found in one of the ledgers." They hurried back to join the group, where the graduate student was carefully turning the pages of what appeared to be a personal journal rather than a business ledger. "I found this tucked inside the back cover of the 1933 distribution records," he explained. "It appears to be your grandfather's private notes about the operation, including his plans for after Prohibition ended." Jack leaned in, immediately recognizing the handwriting as his grandfather's distinctive script. The journal entries began in January 1933, as rumors of Prohibition's imminent end were spreading across the country. "Listen to this entry from February 1933, Thomas said, reading aloud. "Word from Chicago suggests repeal is coming by year's end. Must consider options for the business. Simple shutdown would waste years of investment and connections. P suggests legitimate distillery possible, with proper licenses and political considerations. Worth investigating. P must be Joseph Novak," Professor Winters suggested, "the construction partner we identified earlier." Thomas turned to another entry, dated June 1933. "Meeting with bank officials productive. Dairy expansion loan approved based on farm's remarkable productivity during Depression. If they only knew. This provides perfect opportunity to transition assets from underground to above board. We'll begin dismantling shipping operation while preserving core infrastructure for potential future use. The journal continued with detailed plans for converting the bootlegging profits into legitimate dairy expansion, using the bank loans as cover for the source of capital. Franklin Reynolds had meticulously documented how he would launder his illicit gains through approved channels, creating a paper trail that would withstand scrutiny while setting up the farm for generations of prosperity. He was thinking long-term, Michael remarked, impressed by his great-grandfather's strategic planning. Not just reacting to circumstances, but anticipating changes and positioning the farm accordingly. The most revealing entry came from December 1933, after Prohibition's official repeal. Final shipments completed. Main tunnel access to be sealed beneath new silo foundation. Secondary entrance in North Woodlot collapsed as planned. All equipment sterilized and preserved in case of future need. Joseph suggests spirits market will eventually rebound with premium for aged products, worth storing best stock for future generations. Perhaps my son or grandson will find use for these assets when the time is right. Jack felt a chill run through him at these words. His grandfather hadn't merely hidden the tunnels. He had deliberately preserved them and their contents as a resource for future generations of the family, anticipating a time when they might again provide value to the farm. He left this for us to find, Jack said quietly, not immediately but eventually, when the farm needed it again. Professor Winters nodded, clearly moved by the personal connection across generations. It's remarkable foresight. He understood that prohibition created temporary legal barriers to an industry that would eventually return to legitimacy. By preserving everything, he was creating a time capsule that would one day have both historical and commercial value. "There's one more entry you should see," Thomas said, turning to the final page of the journal. From April 1934, after the silo construction was completed. The entry was brief but poignant. Foundation poured over tunnel entrance, sealing access completely. Farm appearing prosperous with new dairy equipment and expanded herd, neighbors none the wiser about true source of capital. Difficult to close this chapter, but farm's future now secure for James and generations beyond. If necessity ever drives them to seek additional resources, perhaps they will discover what lies beneath. The Reynolds land provides for those willing to work it, sometimes in unexpected ways. A thoughtful silence fell over the group as the words bridged the decades, connecting Franklin Reynolds' concerns for his family's future directly to their present circumstances. Jack felt a profound sense of continuity, as if his grandfather had somehow anticipated this moment when another generation of Reynolds would face challenges requiring unconventional solutions. Dr. Chen was the first to speak, her professional demeanor softened by the personal nature of the discovery. "Your grandfather created a deliberate legacy, Mr. Reynolds. Not just the farm itself, but these alternative resources preserved for a time when they would be needed and valued. It's a remarkable act of intergenerational planning." As the afternoon light began to fade, the academic team packed up their equipment, promising to return the following day to continue their documentation. Professor Winters left them with preliminary preservation recommendations and contacts for specialists in historical restoration who might help develop the site further. After the visitors departed, the family gathered on the porch, watching the sunset paint the fields in golden light. The farm that had seemed to be slipping away just days earlier now felt alive with new possibilities, connected more deeply to its past while opening doors to an unexpected future. "So what's our next move?" Martha asked, voicing the question that hung in the air between them. Michael, who had been quiet since the reading of his great-grandfather's journal, looked up with determination in his eyes. "I think we honor his intentions. He preserved this legacy for future generations to use when the farm faced challenges. That's exactly where we are now. And how do we do that, practically speaking? Jack asked, though he suspected he already knew his son's answer. I've been drafting some ideas, Michael replied, pulling out his ever-present tablet. A phased approach that starts with proper historical preservation but develops into something sustainable. A working historical farm that includes a prohibition museum and educational center. We could even explore creating a craft distillery, using great-grandfather's recipes and techniques, coming full circle from illicit to legitimate production. As Michael outlined his vision, Jack felt the weight of the farm's uncertain future finally lifting completely from his shoulders. The path forward wouldn't be simple, but it was clearer than it had been in years. Not just a desperate holding, action against inevitable loss, but a meaningful evolution that honored the farm's complex history while ensuring its relevance for another generation. Franklin Reynolds had faced his own moment of crisis during the Depression and found an unconventional solution that saved the farm. Now, nearly a century later, his hidden legacy was offering his descendants the same opportunity, a chance to adapt and survive by embracing the farm's full story, both above and below ground. The soil that had sustained the Reynolds family for generations had been hiding more than crops all along. It had preserved a resource planted deliberately by a forward-thinking farmer who understood that true stewardship meant preparing for futures he would never see. An inheritance not just of land and buildings, but of ingenuity, adaptation, and the courage to find new paths when traditional ones failed. Word of the discovery at Reynolds Farm continued to spread, drawing attention far beyond Oak Ridge County. By the end of the week, national news outlets had picked up the story, featuring it in segments about remarkable historical finds. Jack found himself fielding calls from journalists, museum curators, and even a television producer interested in documenting the restoration process for a historical preservation series. The sudden spotlight was both overwhelming and exhilarating. For decades, Jack had operated the farm in relative obscurity, known only to local agricultural circles and neighboring farmers. Now he found himself explaining his family's complex legacy to fascinated strangers, each conversation forcing him to reconsider his understanding of his grandfather's life and choices. It's like discovering we're descendants of a completely different person than we thought, Martha remarked one evening as they scrolled through the latest news coverage on Michael's tablet. Franklin Reynolds, upstanding church deacon, innovative, dairy farmer, and secret bootlegging kingpin of southern Wisconsin. The academic team had expanded their investigation beyond the physical tunnels, diving into county archives, newspaper records, and prohibition enforcement documents to piece together the full story of the Reynolds operation. What emerged was a portrait of a remarkably sophisticated enterprise that had operated completely beneath the notice of authorities for over 6 years. Professor Winters had located records of 3 separate prohibition agent investigations in the county during that period, none of which had identified the Reynolds farm as a potential site of illicit activity. Your grandfather's cover was impeccable, she explained during one of her daily visits. While agents were raiding smaller operations throughout the region, his legitimate dairy business provided perfect camouflage for his underground activities. The most surprising revelation came from an elderly resident of the county nursing home who had contacted them after seeing the local newspaper coverage. Harold Jenkins, now 97, had worked as a delivery driver for a local feed and grain business during the late 1920s, with the Reynolds farm on his regular route. Michael arranged to interview him, bringing along Thomas Rodriguez to document the conversation for the historical record. Harold's memories, though occasionally fuzzy on dates, provided vivid details about the atmosphere of the era and Franklin Reynolds' public persona. Everyone respected Frank Reynolds, Harold recalled, his voice thin but his memories sharp. He ran that dairy farm like clockwork, always paid his bills on time, generous to the church and neighbors in need. Nobody would have believed he was running liquor, which is exactly why he was so successful at it. Harold confirmed what they had begun to suspect, that Franklin's bootlegging operation had been an open secret among a select group of local residents, particularly those from immigrant backgrounds where prohibition was viewed more as an imposition than a moral imperative. Your grandfather had a system, Harold explained, leaning forward in his wheelchair conspiratorially. Deliveries happened during legitimate business visits. I'd drop off feed, and sometimes there'd be a crate mistakenly loaded on my truck for my next stop. Or a farmer would come to buy one of Frank's prized dairy calves and leave with a bit. More than he came for. It was all very discreet, very professional. Most remarkably, Harold confirmed the involvement of Jack's grandmother, Elizabeth Reynolds, in the operation. Far from being an innocent bystander, she had apparently managed the financial side of the business, keeping the books and handling transactions when Franklin was occupied with farm duties. Lizzie was the brains behind a lot of it, Harold chuckled. She had a head for numbers that frightened most men, would write out delivery schedules that looked like ordinary household accounts to anyone who didn't know better. On Sundays, she'd play piano at church with the same fingers that counted bootleg money on Saturday nights. This revelation of his grandmother's involvement completed the transformation of Jack's understanding of his family history. Elizabeth Reynolds, described in family stories as a devoted farmer's wife and pillar of the rural church community, had apparently been a willing and active partner in her husband's illicit business ventures, perhaps even instrumental to their success. I remember my father talking about how his mother insisted he learn proper accounting, Jack told Martha, after Michael shared Harold's interview notes. He always said she believed in keeping accurate books, no matter the business. I guess she meant that more literally than anyone realized. The historical assessment of the tunnel system was completed by the end of the second week, resulting in a comprehensive report that officially classified the discovery as a site of exceptional historical significance, representing one of the most complete and well-preserved rural Prohibition-era operations yet documented in the United States. Professor Winters delivered the report personally, along with news that the State Historical Society was prepared to fast-track the property for historic designation if the family chose to pursue that option. With the initial documentation complete, the Reynolds family faced important decisions about next steps. Michael had temporarily extended his stay, working remotely for his engineering firm while helping coordinate the various experts, officials, and media representatives now regularly visiting the farm. His initial ideas about developing the site had evolved into a detailed proposal, which he presented one evening after dinner. Based on everything we've learned, I see 3 viable paths forward, he explained, spreading diagrams across the kitchen table. First, we could partner with a museum or historical society for complete preservation, essentially turning the tunnels and related artifacts over to public stewardship while maintaining the farm operations separately. Jack nodded, considering this option. It would relieve them of the responsibility and cost of preservation while ensuring the historical significance was properly recognized. But something about completely separating the underground history from the ongoing farm operations felt wrong, dividing his grandfather's legacy rather than honoring its interconnection. The second option, Michael continued, is to develop the site ourselves as a historical attraction integrated with the farm. We'd offer guided tours of the tunnel system, create exhibits about rural bootlegging operations during Prohibition, and potentially incorporate agricultural tourism elements that show how the legitimate farm and illicit operation coexisted. This approach appealed to Jack more strongly. It would maintain family control while creating a new revenue stream that could ensure the farm's survival. The thought of visitors learning about both aspects of his grandfather's ingenuity, the innovative dairy farming above ground and the sophisticated bootlegging below, felt right, a more complete honoring of the Reynolds legacy. The third option is the most ambitious, Michael said, revealing a final set of plans. We restore not just the historical elements, but revive the production aspect as well. Using grandfather's recipes and techniques, we establish a craft distillery, operation that connects directly to the historical narrative. Visitors could tour the Prohibition tunnels, then sample spirits made according to the original Franklin Reynolds formulas, legally produced in a modern facility that pays homage to its illicit origins. The third proposal created an immediate buzz of excitement. It was bold, requiring significant investment and navigating complex regulations, but it offered something the other approaches didn't: a living continuation of Franklin Reynolds's entrepreneurial spirit rather than simply preserving its historical artifacts. That's the one, Jack said decisively, surprising even himself with his quick embrace of the most ambitious option. That's what grandfather would have done. He didn't just preserve things. He built things, adapted them, made them work for changing times. Martha studied her husband's face, seeing the spark of excitement that had been missing for too many years as the farm struggled against economic headwinds. It would be a complete transformation of our lives, she said carefully. We know farming, not tourism or distilling, which is why we'd need help, Michael acknowledged. I've been researching potential partners, craft distillers who might be interested in the unique historical connection, tourism development consultants who specialize in agricultural heritage sites. This wouldn't be something we'd have to figure out entirely on our own. As they discussed the practicalities, Jack found himself increasingly drawn to the vision of a revitalized Reynolds farm that honored its past while creating a sustainable future. The resources they would need were substantial, but the discovery had already attracted attention from potential investors intrigued by the unique historical narrative and business opportunity. If we're seriously considering this direction, Martha said, ever practical, we should consult with a lawyer experienced in both historical properties and alcohol production. There are going to be regulatory hurdles we haven't even thought of yet. Michael nodded in agreement. I've already reached out to a firm in Milwaukee that specializes in craft beverage startups. They're interested in meeting next week to discuss the concept. They've helped several historical properties navigate similar transitions. The conversation continued late into the night, exploring details, raising concerns and gradually shaping a vision that felt both ambitious and attainable. By the time they turned in, a tentative plan had taken form. They would pursue the integrated approach, developing both the historical site and a modern craft distillery that would connect past and present while creating a sustainable business model for the farm's future. The following morning, Jack rose early as always, the farmer's habit of decades unchanged, despite the transformative possibilities now under consideration. As he made his rounds, checking on livestock and equipment, he found himself seeing the property through new eyes, not just as the familiar fields and buildings that had defined his daily existence for decades, but as a place of hidden history and unexpected potential. The collapsed silo, initially a disaster, now stood as a symbol of revelation and opportunity. Jack paused beside it, noting how Pete Johnson's crew had secured the area around the tunnel entrance with more permanent structures, creating a protected access point that preserved the original timber framing while ensuring safety and security. From this vantage point, Jack could envision how visitors might experience the property, approaching the historic farm buildings, learning about traditional dairy operations, then discovering the secret world beneath that had sustained the agricultural enterprise during the nation's great experiment with prohibition. The narrative was compelling, a uniquely American story of adaptation, ingenuity, and the complex morality of an era when national law had collided with cultural traditions and economic necessities. His contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of Professor Winters earlier than expected. She emerged from her car with uncharacteristic excitement, waving a folder of documents. "Mr. Reynolds, I found something remarkable in the county archives," she called as she approached, "something that adds an entirely new dimension to your grandfather's operation." Jack led her to the farmhouse, where Martha was just setting out morning coffee. Michael joined them moments later, and Professor Winters spread her discovery across the kitchen table with the air of someone revealing a long-hidden treasure. "These are Sheriff's Department records from 1927 through 1933, she explained, pointing to official letterheads. "Monthly reports on prohibition enforcement efforts in the county. I was reviewing them to understand the local context of your grandfather's operation, but I found something unexpected." She indicated a series of notations appearing regularly. Throughout the reports, cryptic references to Source FR, providing information that led to raids on competing bootlegging operations. "FR, Franklin Reynolds," she explained. "Your grandfather appears to have been a confidential informant for the local sheriff's department, selectively identifying other bootleggers in the region." Jack stared at the documents in astonishment. Grandfather was informing on other bootleggers while running his own operation? "It appears so," Professor Winters confirmed, "and quite strategically. Notice the pattern. He primarily identified operations that were selling low-quality or dangerous products, particularly those using methanol or other harmful additives that were causing health problems. He was essentially helping eliminate the dangerous elements in the local black market while protecting his own higher-quality operation." Michael examined the documents with growing fascination. So he positioned himself as a public safety asset to law enforcement while simultaneously breaking the same laws. That's remarkably calculated. "It also explains why his operation was never raided," Professor Winters added. "He had effectively rendered himself valuable to local enforcement, created a protective relationship that shielded his business from scrutiny." There are even notes here suggesting that Sheriff Davis personally vouched for Reynolds when federal agents were in the area, describing him as a cooperating citizen above suspicion. This revelation of his grandfather's strategic relationship with law enforcement added yet another layer to Jack's understanding of the man whose legacy he had inherited. Franklin Reynolds had not merely been breaking the law, he had been skillfully navigating the complex moral and legal landscape of prohibition, positioning himself as both outlaw and public servant in a carefully maintained balancing act. He was protecting his community and his business simultaneously, Jack observed, a newfound admiration in his voice. Making sure people weren't being poisoned by bad liquor while ensuring his operation remained protected. It's almost public-spirited in a strange way. Prohibition created many such moral ambiguities, Professor Winters agreed. Many Americans, including some law enforcement officers, viewed selective enforcement as more practical and ultimately more beneficial than the impossible task of complete suppression. Your grandfather appears to have understood and leveraged that reality quite effectively. As they discussed this latest discovery, Jack found himself reflecting on the layers of complexity in his grandfather's character. The church-going family. Man, the innovative dairy farmer, the sophisticated bootlegger, and now the strategic informant who had helped shape local enforcement practices. Franklin Reynolds had been navigating a much more complicated world than family stories had ever suggested, making difficult choices in challenging times. This actually strengthens the narrative for any historical presentation, Michael noted, his mind already turning to how this information might be incorporated into their developing plans. It adds nuance to the story, Not just a simple tale of breaking the law for profit, but a more complex exploration of how people navigated the contradictions of Prohibition America. Professor Winters nodded enthusiastically. Precisely. The most compelling historical presentations acknowledge these complexities, rather than presenting simplified heroes and villains. Your grandfather's story offers a fascinating window into how rural Americans actually experienced and responded to prohibition, not with simple compliance or defiance, but with sophisticated adaptation to a policy many viewed as fundamentally misguided. The conversation shifted to how this new information might be incorporated into their developing plans for the property. Professor Winters suggested creating an interpretive center that would place the Reynolds operation within the broader context of prohibition history, using the family story to illuminate larger historical themes about law, morality, adaptation, and rural ingenuity. The presentation outlined their three-phase development plan in detail. Phase 1 would focus on preserving and restoring the tunnel system and speakeasy, creating safe visitor access while maintaining historical authenticity. This would include structural reinforcement, appropriate lighting, climate control to protect artifacts, and the development of interpretive displays explaining the historical context of rural bootlegging operations. Phase 2 would involve the construction of a visitor center in the style of a 1920s dairy barn, housing exhibits on farming during the Depression and Prohibition eras, educational spaces for programs and events, and retail areas featuring both historical memorabilia and farm products. This building would serve as the entry point for tunnel tours and the hub of the visitor experience. Phase 3, the most ambitious component, would establish a small batch craft distillery using Franklin Reynolds' original recipes and techniques, creating premium spirits with a direct connection to Prohibition-era production methods. The distillery would operate in a new facility designed to complement the farm's historical aesthetic while meeting modern production standards and regulatory requirements. What makes this concept unique, Michael emphasized, is the direct lineage from illegal to legal production. We're not just creating products inspired by prohibition, we're reviving actual recipes developed during that period by a master distiller who happened to be operating outside the law. These aren't reproductions or approximations. They're the genuine continuation of a century-old tradition. The financial projections, developed with assistance from a business consultant specializing in heritage tourism, showed a path to profitability within 3 years of full operation. The initial capital requirements were substantial, but the unique historical assets and compelling narrative offered potential returns that had already attracted serious interest from several investment groups. Professor Winters provided academic validation for the historical significance of the site, presenting findings from her team's ongoing research into the Reynolds operation and its place within the broader context of prohibition in rural America. What we have here is not just a well-preserved physical space, she explained, but a comprehensive archive documenting the business activities of a sophisticated rural bootlegging operation, something rarely captured in historical records. Because of their illicit nature, she displayed photographs of the ledgers, distribution records, and recipe books discovered in the tunnel system, explaining their exceptional value to historians studying this period. Most of what we know about prohibition comes from law enforcement perspectives, records of raids, arrests, and seized equipment. The Reynolds archive provides the other side of the story, how these operations actually functioned as businesses when they weren't being disrupted by authorities. The presentation concluded with Jack speaking about the family's commitment to honoring both aspects of their heritage, the legitimate agricultural tradition and the previously hidden bootlegging enterprise. His straightforward farmer's perspective, provided an authentic emotional foundation that resonated strongly with the assembled guests. "My grandfather built this farm twice," Jack explained, his weathered hands gesturing toward the fields visible through the barn windows. "First, with his bootlegging operation during Prohibition, then with the dairy business that sustained my family for generations. Both represent the same core values: determination, ingenuity, and adaptation to challenging circumstances. Our plan honors that complete legacy, not just the parts that were publicly acceptable." The response exceeded the family's expectations. The investment group representatives expressed immediate interest in providing significant capital in exchange for a minority partnership stake. The tourism development experts offered enthusiastic support, noting the project's potential to become a regional destination that could anchor broader heritage tourism initiatives throughout the area. Most surprisingly, the historical preservation officials, whom the family had feared might impose restrictive conditions on development, proved to be among the most supportive voices in the room. The State Historical Preservation Director personally endorsed the integrated approach, praising the way it balanced authentic preservation with sustainable economic use. As they talked, Jack found himself increasingly committed to the path they were considering. His grandfather had faced the challenges of his era with creativity and determination, finding unconventional solutions that preserved the farm while navigating complex moral territory. Now, nearly a century later, the Reynolds family was poised to do the same, honoring that legacy of adaptation while ensuring the farm's continued relevance in a changing world. "I think we move forward with the full plan," Jack announced, making his decision official. "The historical preservation, the tourism development, and the craft distillery, all of it. It's what grandfather would have done, taken the resources at hand and built something that would secure the farm's future." Martha reached across the table to take his hand, her expression supportive, though still carrying traces of practical concern. "It won't be easy. We're talking about completely transforming our lives and work. But we'll be doing it together," Michael added, "as a family. And we're not abandoning the farm, we're evolving it, just as grandfather did when he built the dairy operation with his bootlegging profits. The land stays in the family. The legacy continues, just in a form adapted to current realities." As Professor Winters gathered her documents, promising to provide copies for their records, Jack felt a sense of clarity and purpose that had been absent for too long. The discovery beneath the collapsed silo had done more than reveal a hidden chapter of family history. It had illuminated a path forward, connecting past and future in ways he could never have anticipated. The Reynolds farm would continue, not just as a struggling dairy operation fighting against economic headwinds, but as a multifaceted enterprise that celebrated its complex heritage while creating new opportunities. The land that had supported generations of Reynolds farmers would remain in the family, its purpose evolving, but its significance preserved. Franklin Reynolds had hidden his bootlegging operation beneath the legitimate farm, creating a dual legacy of above-ground respectability and underground enterprise. Now his grandson would bring that dual legacy into the light, transforming what had once been criminal necessity into historical treasure and modern opportunity. It was a fitting continuation of the adaptability and determination that had always characterized the Reynolds approach to farming and family legacy. The storm that had collapsed the old silo had not, as Jack initially feared, destroyed another piece of family history. Instead, it had revealed the true foundation upon which the modern Reynolds farm had been built, not just soil and concrete, but ingenuity, adaptability, and the courage to find unconventional paths when traditional ones proved insufficient. In that revelation lay not just historical discovery, but the seeds of future renewal. the transformation of Reynolds Farm began with careful planning and strategic partnerships. Jack, Martha, and Michael spent countless hours in consultation with experts ranging from historical preservationists to craft beverage consultants, gradually developing a comprehensive business plan that would honor the site's unique history, while creating a sustainable future. 1 month after the initial discovery, they held their first formal meeting with potential investors. The farmhouse kitchen, which had served as the family's planning center, was deemed too informal for such an important presentation. Instead, they converted the barn's main floor into a temporary presentation space with professionally printed displays showcasing their vision for what they now called Reynolds Heritage Farm and Distillery. Among the invited guests were representatives from a craft spirits investment group based in Chicago, 2 regional tourism development experts, Professor Winters and her colleagues from the State University, and several officials from both county and state historical preservation offices. The gathering represented a pivotal moment for the Reynolds family, the formal unveiling of their ambitious plan to transform their struggling dairy operation into a multifaceted historical and agricultural tourism destination. Michael took the lead in presenting their vision, his engineering background lending precision and credibility to the technical aspects of the proposal. "What we're proposing is not simply a museum or a distillery," he explained, standing before a rendering of the planned development. "It's a living historical experience that connects visitors directly to a fascinating chapter of American history, through the authentic story of one family's ingenuity during Prohibition." 2 years later, the Reynolds Heritage Farm and Distillery welcomed its 10,000th visitor. The former dairy operation had transformed into one of the Midwest's premier historical attractions, drawing tourists, spirits enthusiasts, and historians from across the country. The farm's centerpiece was now the Revelation, the beautifully restored tunnel system that had remained hidden for nearly 90 years. Visitors descended through an entrance artfully constructed from the original silo foundation stones, emerging into the meticulously preserved speakeasy where Franklin Reynolds had once served his premium spirits to select customers. On this particularly special day, Jack stood beside the copper still that now produced legal spirits using his grandfather's rediscovered recipes. The FR Special Reserve had won 3 international awards in its first year of production, with critics marveling at the complexity of a century-old formula brought back to life. "What amazes me most," Jack told the gathered crowd of visitors, "isn't that my grandfather built this operation, but that he had the foresight to preserve it for future generations. He didn't just hide his past. He safeguarded it, believing someday it would matter again." The farm now employed 27 people, including 7 members of the Reynolds family. Michael and Sarah had built a home on the property there, children representing the 5th generation to live on the land. The dairy operation continued on a smaller scale, providing both historical demonstrations and fresh products for the farm-to-table restaurant that now occupied the renovated barn. Martha, ever practical, had developed an educational program that brought school groups to learn not just about Prohibition history, but about agricultural adaptation and entrepreneurship through challenging economic times. "We're not just teaching history," she would explain to teachers. "We're showing how innovation and determination can transform circumstances, no matter the era." Professor Winters had published a book about the discovery, Underground Economy, The Secret History of Rural Bootlegging, featuring the Reynolds operation as its central case study. The publication had sparked renewed academic interest in how rural communities had navigated Prohibition, challenging urban-centered narratives that had dominated historical understanding of the period. The most meaningful moment came when a museum in Chicago returned something unexpected to the family, a framed photograph of Franklin and Elizabeth Reynolds receiving a community service award from their church in 1932 at the height of their secret bootlegging operation. The image had been discovered in the museum's archives during research for an exhibition on Midwestern Prohibition history. They lived two lives, Jack remarked, studying his grandparents' formal poses and serious expressions, but both were authentic in their own way. They were building something that would outlast them, both above and below ground. As dusk settled over the farm one evening, Jack found himself alone in the speakeasy room, sitting at the rough-hewn table where his grandfather had once tallied accounts from his illicit business. The preservation team had installed historically accurate lighting that mimicked the oil lamps that would have illuminated the space in the 1920s, casting warm, flickering shadows against the stone walls. Jack ran his hand along the table's weathered surface, feeling the grooves and marks left by decades of use and abandonment. From disaster had come discovery, from loss had come renewal. The storm that had destroyed the silo had revealed not just hidden tunnels, but a path forward, a way to honor the past while securing the future. When visitors asked if he regretted the loss of the historic silo, Jack always offered the same response. What looked like destruction was actually revelation. Sometimes we need to lose what we think matters to discover what truly does. The Reynolds family story had become more than local history. It had captured something universal about American resilience and adaptation. Each visitor who descended into the tunnels emerged with a deeper understanding of how ordinary people navigate extraordinary circumstances, finding paths through even the most challenging times. The old silo foundation, once a symbol of agricultural tradition, now framed the entrance to a different kind of heritage, equally authentic and perhaps more profound in its complexity. The collapsed structure that Jack had initially mourned had literally opened the ground to a richer understanding of his family's legacy, not just as farmers, but as survivors, innovators, and keepers of secrets that would eventually become treasures. What hidden history might be waiting beneath your family's foundations? This question, which concluded each guided tour, inevitably sparked animated discussions among visitors about their own ancestral mysteries and forgotten family stories. After all, the Reynolds farm had seemed ordinary until a storm revealed its extraordinary secrets. How many other seemingly simple family histories contained hidden dimensions, not necessarily bootlegging tunnels, but unexpected chapters of adaptation, innovation, and quiet courage in challenging times? The story that had begun with a farmer's desperate inspection of a damaged silo during a storm had expanded into a narrative that connected past and present, illuminating not just one family's history, but broader themes of American ingenuity and resilience. Have you ever wondered what untold stories might be hidden in your family's history? What unexpected legacy might be waiting to be discovered? The Reynolds family never imagined that a collapsing silo would reveal the true foundation of their farm's success, a secret that transformed their understanding of their past and opened new possibilities for their future. If stories of hidden history and remarkable discoveries fascinate you, make sure you're subscribed to our channel. We bring you authentic tales of ordinary people whose lives reveal extraordinary chapters of American history. Next week, we'll explore an abandoned mining town where a school teacher discovered a time capsule that rewrote local history and reunited families separated for generations. Tell us in the comments about any family mysteries or unexpected discoveries in your own heritage. Who knows? Your story might inspire our next investigation into America's hidden history. And remember, sometimes what appears to be destruction is merely the first step toward revelation.